Hello, everybody. Happy Black History Month, and welcome to the fourth installment of the speaker series, The Liberal Imaginary and Beyond, which is co-sponsored by the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. I'm Benjamin Schewel, a senior fellow at the Kenan Institute for Ethics and director of the Center on Modernity and Transition, and I'll be one of your hosts for this speaker series.
And I'm Shahrzad Sabet. I'm a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and I'm also your host for this series.
So the aim of this speaker series is to examine the origins, the contents, and development of liberal thought after the Second World War, so in the last 70-odd years, as well as to consider significant attempts to move beyond the resultant social imaginary without casting aside its impressive achievements. We're thrilled to have with us today Lawrence Blum and Derik Smith, who will be discussing the topic Oneness and Difference in the Discourse on Race. So Lawrence Blum is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy and Distinguished Professor of Liberal Arts and Education at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He is the author of I'm Not a Racist But, and co-author of the forthcoming book, Integrations, The Struggle for Racial Equality and Civic Renewal in Public Education, which will be coming out this spring. Derik Smith is Associate Professor of Literature at Claremont McKenna College and author of the book Robert Hayden in Verse, New Histories of African American Poetry and the Black Arts Era. Larry, Derik, welcome.
Glad to be here. Great to be here, thanks.
So we'd like to begin each conversation on a personal biographical note. Could you start by telling us a bit about the experiences and personal histories that led you to focus in your academic work, but also in your personal life, on questions about oneness and difference and race? Derik, perhaps we can begin with you.
Thanks, Bennett. Just first of all, it's a real great honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this speaker series that's been so rich thus far. I think that to start out with, I'll go back a couple, maybe one generation to begin with my mother, who came to the United States in 1960 from Germany. And she was about 18 years old at that time. And she'd been a child during World War II, which she never spoke about with me. She didn't speak very much about her parents either. But she came to the US in 1960, and after a little bit more than 10 years here, she met my father, who came from a large African-American family, about 9 siblings he had, who moved, the family, his father, my grandfather, moved from South Georgia to Michigan in the 1930s. And on my father's side, my grandfather, he never went to school. He was a highly successful person in many rights, yet he was illiterate. And my grandmother had a very basic literacy. She went to school to about 8th grade, but they managed to send all of their children to college. And in college is where my mother and father met at University of Michigan. And soon after they met, they were married. And they moved to the small Caribbean island of St. John, where I grew up. And they moved there in order to support a small Baha'i community in that part of the world. And so I was raised in the Baha'i faith. And I would say my strong ideals, my commitments to concepts of justice and oneness and the possibility, of racial oneness, those play a strong role in my teaching, in my writing, the way I live my life. Obviously, those are rooted in the Baha'i faith, and also in the model offered to me by my parents. Another thing that I think has I've reflected upon this a lot, and I feel that a lot of my ethical consciousness, if you will, comes from first the forces of modernity, right? I think that my concepts of race and everything, like everyone else's, are really strongly shaped by these constructions of modernity that we all inherit. So that's one thing. But then in terms of what we might call a more critical consciousness, it comes from growing up in the Caribbean in the 1980s and 90s. And, the cultural context of the Caribbean in that moment was suffused by a kind of decolonizing ethos in politics, right? And also a kind of Pan-Africanist ethos that was very strong in my upbringing. Every day I would hear reggae music like all around me. I would go to the basketball court every night from the time I was about 13 until I was 17. And every night, we just, it was all this kind of, let's say, reggae infused environment. And when I would go to school every day, I would pass by, these large murals. Oftentimes, they would depict figures of like Pan-African heroes like Haile Selassie or Marcus Garvey and so forth. And a lot of my peers were deeply influenced by Rastafarianism and the kind of decolonizing impulses of that culture. And so in many ways, my thinking about sort of racial difference, but also racial oneness, because in, particularly Rastafarianism and the reggae music and so forth, there's a strong commitment to ideals of universalism and justice, attached to justice and this sense of racial righteousness. So like those were the influences that I think really have structured my thought. And then, when I was an adult, I came to the US and started doing African-American literary studies. And of course, my reading in the Black intellectual tradition has really shaped me a lot in terms of my own thinking and work.
So Larry, how about you? What are some of the experiences that led you to focus on the topic of race?
I see. Okay, so I, in a way, prepared a sort of a different an answer to a slightly different question, which was about oneness. And I want to say that my own professional background is as a moral philosopher. I did moral philosophy for about 20 years as my primary subject, and I've always been very interested in the emotion-based elements of morality, such as compassion, empathy, care, and so on, as contrasted with a kind of more rationalist tradition that one finds in Kant. So a lot of my early work was kind of pushing back against that rationalism. At some point, I shifted into working primarily on race. It was kind of a slow transition. It had much to do with the fact that my children, I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and when my children were coming up in the 1980s, they went to the public schools. And Cambridge, despite primarily being known for its great universities, was, especially at that time, an extremely diverse, both economically and racially and ethnically, community. And my kids were just in these extremely diverse classes, and I became active as a parent in kind of racial justice issues and sort of the cultural issues and class issues connected to that. And it started to seep into my professional work. I was kind of doing this as a parent, but I just started reflecting much more about race. And then in the 1980s, there were a group of African-American philosophers who were trying to bring issues of race into the field of philosophy, which had been somewhat more resistant to racial concerns than many other disciplines had been. And I was very influenced by that group. I'm sure it overlapped with some of the people that Derik was thinking about as well. So starting in the 90s, I primarily worked on racial issues. And I got interested at some point in issues of racial solidarity. But that interest didn't really make contact with my interest in these emotional dimensions of morality until I was invited to give a talk at an East-West conference in Hong Kong several years ago. And in preparation for that conference, I wrote a paper that construed racial solidarity as itself a kind of oneness. And so I was sort of thinking about racial solidarity as oneness, and that connected with the other interests that I had in these, I was saying I called them emotion-based sentiments such as compassion, but I was influenced especially by Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century German philosopher, who saw compassion as the kind of core moral sentiment, but he he gave it a very strong metaphysical underpinning, which he located in the Buddhist and Hindu traditions, which is sort of unusual for a Western philosopher to be as influenced as Schopenhauer was by kind of Eastern wisdom. And I've always been interested in that aspect of Schopenhauer, though I didn't sort of follow it into Eastern philosophy that much. But anyway, the conference brought together both the racial solidarity part and the metaphysical oneness part.
Well, thank you for sharing some of that personal context to start the conversation. And I promise, Larry, we'll come back much more directly to the question of oneness again. 2020 was a remarkable year in that a tragically unremarkable event, the killing of a Black person by law enforcement, sparked unprecedented outcry both within the United States and beyond. And of course, all of this unfolded against the backdrop of a pandemic that exposed in yet one more way the catastrophic racial injustices that pervade virtually every aspect of our society. And so our profound struggle with this most challenging and pervasive of issues continues. Now, it might seem obvious that recognizing our oneness as human beings is essential to upending and redressing these ravages. But whether it's in thought or in practice, the relationship between our oneness and our differences is considerably more complicated. Universalist appeals to our common humanity, for instance, can obscure the divergent realities that constitute the human experience. They can suppress the recognition of marginalized experiences and further reinforce or further amplify dominant narratives as the universal one. You have both, as you started to mention, you've both grappled with these types of tensions in your work, but from different or through different disciplinary lenses. Larry, as you said, you're a moral philosopher who draws on and also contributes to a variety of disciplines, including education. Derik, you approach these questions primarily through the lens of African-American literary studies. So given your respective academic backgrounds and experiences, I want to start by asking you first, how would you define or conceptualize the contours of the relationship between oneness and difference in the discourse on race? And how should we be thinking about navigating those contours? Derik, let's start with you.
Thanks, Shahrzad. I think that I'll try and speak to the second question or the last question first, which is about, how do we navigate these contours of oneness and difference in the discourse of race? And I think, we need to do it with many things in mind, right? And for me, I'll begin with ideals, kind of like, I think we have to have an absolute commitment to principles of justice, for example, as we navigate these kind of contours. We need to have our eyes fixed on an authentic unity, like the need for an authentic unity. And I think we always need to sort of foster the recognition that, while these categories of race are mortally consequential for people, they are at the same time also like mythical categories, right? And they're produced through social narratives. And for this reason, they're all, they're fluid, and to a certain degree, they're changing, right? And I wanted to offer up a kind of like a definition of race that I think is, there's a lot of definitions for this category. But this is one that I find very powerful. I'm just going to read it here. It's from one of my favorite historians in Black studies. His name is Michael Gomez. And he says, he describes race as a culturally orchestrated, socially sanctioned disaggregation and reformulation of the human species into broad hierarchical categories purported to reflect respective levels of capacity, propensity, and beauty, and in ways often tethered to phenotypic, somatic, bodily expression. And I like this definition because it does a few things, right? It calls our attention to the constructed nature of the difference. It's orchestrated, right? Meaning it's manipulated into being. And it calls our attention to a fundamental human oneness at the level of species that is then disaggregated differentiated, and usually according to these somatic markers, right? And then the categories are placed in hierarchical relations, right? And so I think these are important ideas to keep in mind. And then if that's how we kind of define the racial difference, right? Using this definition of race that helps us. I think that the development of a historical consciousness, like a strong historical consciousness, is something that we also should try to cultivate in navigating this discourse, because it's hard to do that in the face of later modernity, which always bids us to kind of a headlong rush into the future, right? Where we can't remember what happened 5 minutes ago or 5 days ago, let alone 5 years ago or 500 years ago, right? And so there's a kind of induced amnesia that happens in later modernity, to my mind. And so every once in a while, something like the spectacular murder of George Floyd in a very public way happens, and we're jolted out of this sort of state of amnesia, in America at least, and we come to recognize how central and violent the concept of racial difference is to the modern West. And then we start to sort of remember the past, right? So if we're navigating the contours of racial difference and oneness with a kind of longue durée historical consciousness, we see that the particular kind of racial difference that's so consequential today was produced in the period of early modernity, right? When the categories such as Blackness and Whiteness were really coalescing as European powers began colonizing projects that targeted the New World, exploiting, the lands of the Americas and the Caribbean, and then exploiting the labor of enslaved West Africans, right? And so, our conceptions of racial difference find their modern roots in that project, right? And so what we think of as racial difference is a conceptual framework that was primarily used to facilitate the colonial project. And I want to point out that project, in which racial difference was created, or the modern sense of racial difference was created, it also created racial oneness in a kind of strange way, right? Because by that I mean that diverse groups were gathered together under these within these categories. So like Protestants and Catholics and Portuguese and Spanish and French and English became white, essentially, right? And people as diverse as like the Navajo, the Taino in the Caribbean, and where I am in California, the Tongva people, they all sort of coalesced under this rubric of the Indian, and the same is true, of course, of West Africans, and all of Africans eventually, right? Like you have Ashanti people, Mandinka people, Wolof people, Igbo people, and so forth, all gathered together in the oneness of this category of Blackness, right? And so I think that, when we think about sort of racial difference in the modern sense, we think about sort of these constructed categories, and then we think about the primacy of chattel slavery in the construction of the modern West, right? And, it's in that 400-year institution that we see what Western philosophers were calling natural rights, stripped from those who were categorized as Black. And I think that through the development of a historical consciousness, we begin to recognize that these differences and the hierarchies that were created around racial difference were primarily developed in service of this kind of viciously violent and hugely successful European economic project, right? Our conceptions of racial difference and all the stigmas, and I think these are so important for the conversation, all the stigmas and honors that get attached to these different categories were orchestrated to justify the material and rights inequities that characterize modernity. So I'll stop with that.
Larry?
So I'm going to approach this from a sort of a different angle, though I kind of love what Derik just said, and I have some things to say later that connect to it more directly. But so I'm leaving out the oneness portion of your question and focusing just on the universality versus difference dimension. So on the most general level, there's no real difficulty in reconciling universality and difference. As human persons, we share certain characteristics in common, and there's others in which we differ. But that simple formulation masks three difficulties with this universality difference issue. The first is a human tendency to forget about one of them when you're focused on the other one. In thinking about my particularities or the particularities of my particular group, however defined, it just is easy to lose sight of what I and my group, however defined, share with others. There's just a human tendency to forget when you're focused on the difference, to forget the commonality, but vice versa as well. Focusing on common humanity and shared personhood can also make us lose sight of the deep ways in which we differ. The challenge is to hold both of these truths in our mind simultaneously. It's a both-and situation, but it's very challenging to make that both-and happen. A second difficulty is connected with race specifically. Race is not just a type of human difference, as, say, ethnicity or culture is. It defines an axis of historical and continuing injustice, which Derik spoke to very eloquently. And so it's not a matter of just recognizing, for example, that the experience of being Black is different from the experience of being white, but also recognizing that the difference between those groups and those experiential differences are deeply framed by injustice and oppression. This distinction between, as it were, sort of mere difference, an important difference, but mere difference versus injustice, tends to get lost in some writings on recognition. For example, the early writings of Charles Taylor, who appeared in your lecture series a couple months ago, and who Taylor was instrumental in bringing the idea of recognition to the fore, and as a kind of foundation of multiculturalist literature, especially of the 90s. That literature, and including Taylor's contribution to it, tended to conflate the recognition of cultural difference with recognition of injustice-based differences, such as racial differences. And it's important to keep that distinction in mind. And that sort of tends, therefore, to modify the kind of universality versus difference way of framing it. A third point, though, is in the spirit of your question, is that invoking the universal is sometimes used to mask or even reject the particularity of difference. And we see this in people's use of the all lives matter framing in response to the Black Lives Matter, both the movement and, in a sense, the insight on which the movement is founded. Often the universal formulation is primarily a way of denying the claims of the Black Lives Matter movement. Though somewhat more charitably, I think for some people who invoke it, they are confused why you should single out one particular group and say that their lives matter, when we should believe that all human lives matter. That's a more kind of charitable attribution to someone. But, I'm saying that some people just invoke all lives matter as a way to basically reject the idea that Black Lives Matter, whereas other people are genuinely confused about it. So there's a weekly small Black Lives Matter protest at a busy intersection near my home. And there's one of the regulars at this demonstration has a sign that says, yes, all lives matter, but not all lives are threatened by racist violence. The cars that drive past might find it difficult to spend the time to take in that whole message, but it's a great message, and it beautifully expresses the way that, as your question suggests, invocations of universalism can divert from the fact that sometimes the plight of a particular group needs to be highlighted, not because they're special or an exception to a common humanity, but precisely because the universal principle is in much greater danger of not being honored in their case. So to sort of return, I do think that the challenge of kind of holding in our minds simultaneously both the universal commonalities we have and also the important differences is possible, but it is challenging in some of these particular ways I mentioned.
Thank you. I want to turn now, and we've already begun to talk about it, but turn now a bit more directly to this concept of human oneness and its expression in various forms of universalism. The prevailing expression of oneness in the liberal tradition that we're examining in the speaker series is the notion of equality, specifically a commitment to equal respect for the equal moral worth and dignity of all human beings, typically embodied in a set of basic universal rights. And of course, this is a vital and rightly venerated value. But limiting our conception of human oneness in this way seems to present certain pitfalls and challenges. For example, the bonds between human beings that this expression of oneness requires are quite thin and generic. In other words, rationally derived recognitions of universal moral equivalence don't necessarily engender the bonds of deep empathy and kinship and the solidaristic recognitions of distinctness that the work of racial justice seems to so critically require. So, given the steep challenges that we face in this area and the tension between unity and diversity that characterizes these struggles and that we've been talking about, how should we conceptualize the notion of human oneness specifically and the bonds that tie us to one another as human beings? Larry?
Okay, so there is an issue about how to understand oneness, as your question suggests. Is it a rational recognition that every human being is deserving of certain basic rights, as you mentioned, or does it require this deeper emotional bond? That is it something felt, not just something rationally acknowledged? And if it is something felt, there still seems to be significant possible differences about how to understand the feeling that's involved in that oneness. For example, is empathy, which you mentioned, is that a form of oneness? In practice, empathy seldom takes a universalistic form. It can, but it more frequently doesn't. It tends to be directed towards particular other persons, sometimes towards whole groups, but specific groups. People are complicated, and their empathies can be inconsistent if the idea of consistency even applies to empathy, which I'm not sure if it does. People can be empathetically moved by one person's situation, yet not by another one that's very similar. We do not, for example, equally empathize with every needy person whom we encounter, even if their situations are very similar, and even if sometimes upon reflection we think, oh, we should have had the same empathy, but empathy doesn't in fact empirically work out that way. So in order to sort of work out the relation between oneness and difference, we do have to clarify what we mean by oneness, or at least be sort of aware that it can mean different things. A second observation is that the oneness difference issue can show up at all different levels and not only at the universal level. At any level where people feel a sense of oneness with others, there will be differences among those people. And some of these differences might be overlooked if you focus only on the oneness. For example, you referred to the solidaristic recognition of distinctness, which you counterpose to oneness because, say, the distinct group is Black people, and that racial distinctness can get overlooked in the oneness focus. But racial or any other solidarity is itself a kind of oneness, as Derik was saying earlier. And it can mask differences within, say, Black people as the solidaristic groups, such as differences of gender, age, political belief, and so on. These differences are often quite important, as is emphasized by people who are concerned about the notion of intersectionality, which has become a way of thinking about sort of important sub-differences within an overall category. At any level that you can divide humanity into smaller and smaller groups, you can't avoid the oneness difference issue. And you can, I think, always say the same thing, that we can have both a sense of oneness while also recognizing important differences within that group. And yet doing that can be quite challenging because, just to repeat this point, it's easy to lose sight of the differences when you're focused on the oneness, and easy to lose sight of the oneness when you're focused on the difference. It might be that your original question was really, sort of tacitly assumed the universal form of oneness, and that was the one that you meant. But I just want to emphasize that the experience of oneness, depending on how you define it, for example, another definition would be a sense of common purpose rooted in a moral cause. That can apply to smaller groups. So an example that I used in the article that I mentioned, it was from the film Selma from 2014 about Dr. King's organizing of marches from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. There were several different marches that had kind of different characters. But what was particularly powerful about this film, and presumably it reflects the historical reality, but I know it from the film, is that it gave a kind of beautiful portrayal of what it felt like to be part of a group that saw itself as a single body, all marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and all having this common purpose that they knew to be grounded in a righteous cause. And people would come to each other's aid. There was just a sense that we're all one. And so that sense of oneness was, of course, very particularized. It had a racial dimension to it, but it also had a kind of political principle dimension as well as the racial dimension. And I guess all I'm saying is that the notion of oneness has to be taken seriously in its non-universalistic forms as well.
Thank you. Derik, how would you approach the question?
Well, I'll say that, I really appreciated what Larry had to say there. And it kind of made me think a little bit differently about how I wanted to answer the question. And particularly when thinking about the ways in which, that there are differentiations between within onenesses, right? So, I wanted to draw on the example that Larry also did of King and the Black church and so forth. But I think it's important, I'll get to that, but I think it's important to acknowledge that, that we not sort of romanticize ideal or overly idealize certain communities which have cultivated a certain degree of oneness historically. And so but before I get to that point, I think I wanted to point out that it's interesting to me that the roots of the modern liberal tradition and the roots of our modern conceptions of race, both trace back to these moments of Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century European thought, right? And that the social contract of modern liberalism, which is meant to ensure that we have some kind of oneness, some kind of equality within pluralistic societies, it doesn't seem in the contemporary to be up to the task of bridging the differences created by the race, which was also created in that same period, the modern conceptions of race. And so, to my mind, the rational theories of Western philosophy, that lead to these abstract notions of oneness, they've had limited success in developing feelings of empathy and kinship, like we were talking, the question asked about. They haven't been so successful, and to a certain degree they've been successful, but we seem to be coming up against the limitations of what's available to us through these institutions that are coming out of the liberal democratic tradition. And it seems to me that, if we want to look for some of the powerful institutions and communities that have managed to cultivate strong communities of human oneness in the West, at least, one of the places that we might look is the history of the Black church, right, and of Black Christianity. And I think it's actually in this context that we find like very, very strong commitments to universal rights and so forth, and maybe more so, than what is the outcome of like the documents and the writings of Western Enlightenment philosophers. And in the insistence on oneness that we see in Black Christian thinkers was a kind of political strategy, right? I mean, it was a means of promoting abolition, of countering anti-Black ideology. And so there was this development of a kind of universalism that was central to the Black intellectual tradition, a resistance tradition that goes back into the 18th century as well. And if we look at like the evangelical abolitionism of some of like the mother figures of the Black intellectual tradition, like Frances Harper, or someone like, in my field, Phyllis Wheatley, the mother of the African-American literary tradition. She closes her most famous poem, which is called on Being Brought from Africa to America, with an assertion of a spiritually based universalism, right? And the closing couplet of that poem is kind of invested with certain ideas that could be rooted in a sort of anti-Blackness, yet at the same time counteracts that with this ideal of a sort of a universal identity that is born in a kind of spiritual reality. The line is, remember Christians, Negroes, Black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train, right? So, in her condition of enslavement, she posits this universality which is available to, human consciousness through a conception of a spiritual reality, right? So for me, that's kind of important. And I think that, like that tradition in the African American intellectual and political tradition, kind of reaches its apogee in Martin Luther King. And it's rooted in this Christian conception of a humanity which is granted to each individual based on their soul, right? Which is similarly created in the likeness of a God, right? Of God. And so, we see this kind of coming through the abolitionist tradition, and it's the commitment to universalism and oneness in this Black tradition is more deeply rooted in a kind of Christian logic than I think than arguments of natural law and so forth that we might find in the liberal tradition. And so I think that like if we develop this kind of properly tuned historical consciousness that I was talking about before, we can see that, in the Black church, we have this kind of strong tradition here. And that what happens in someone like King and, many other figures besides him is there's this attempt to, I think, weave together some of the ideals of the liberal tradition with a kind of spiritual tradition to kind of like infuse or imbue the rights-based discourse of American liberal democracy, in King's case, with a spirituality, right? And so I think that, if we're looking for a kind of, a thick, deeply rooted kind of a discourse about human oneness and universality, we can find some guideposts in this, Christian thought of the New World, right? A Black Christian thought of the New World, and in America particularly. And so, I think that that the question sort of leads us, the question which questions the thinness, right, and the lack of a connection, which is making it hard for human bonds of true human bonds of oneness to be created merely through sort of the rational processes that are that are bequeathed to us by Enlightenment thought, right? That to counter that or to add to that, we need to have something that is perhaps more sort of spiritualized and mystical, and that we can find one tradition of that in the Black church. I'll talk maybe in some of the other questions. I could talk about how that that tradition has come under a kind of withering attack within Black intellectual community itself. But I think that that's one place that we can look for a tradition of philosophical universalism that could be a powerful a guide into a future.
I want to shift gears maybe just a little bit. Race, and I put it in quotes, isn't just an empirically baseless fiction, as we've been describing or discussing. It's an unusually oppressive and destructive one. And so the case is often made for jettisoning the concept of race while retaining ways to identify and name its harms. But the case for abandoning the concept or category of race comes up against its role in a set of collective identities that carry genuine meaning and value, identities around which deep solidarities and capacities for resilience have been forged, identities around which distinctive cultural expressions have emerged and flourished, and of course, identities around which vitally important histories and narratives are told and retained. So this apparent contradiction between a baseless, destructive category on the one hand, and shared identities and meaning, shared identities of meaning and value on the other, reflects another tension that can characterize collective identities, not the tension between oneness and difference, but the tension between the past and the future, or one might even say between rootedness and fluidity. How do we go from a concept defined by false hierarchies and centuries-long oppression to an identity that transcends this history and gives dynamic, liberated expression to vital and distinctive elements of humanity's cultural endowment? Or is that even the right way to articulate and conceptualize the problem? Derik, I want to go back to you to start us off there.
So I'll start by answering, this question in saying that it seems like hard to imagine in the near future a condition in which we've simply transcended racial difference, right? I mean, and in fact, it seems like the great majority of thinkers aren't really interested in imagining that distant future in which racial difference isn't an organizing social principle. And within the Black intellectual tradition of our moment, the most adamant of those who are aren't interested in thinking beyond race as an organizing social principles are described as Afro-pessimists. And this school of thought is headed up by people like Frank Wilderson and Jared Sexton. These are sort of contemporary African-American theorists that contend that our modern conceptions of the human subject itself, right, are built around racial difference, meaning in particular for Blackness, right, that Blackness has come to be thought about as the sort of the necessary antithesis of an Enlightenment-derived human subject or a citizen protected by the social contract, right? And so these kind of thinkers present us with really deep problems because, they go into this kind of psychological or libidinal dimension and suggest that the difference, racial difference particularly between the Black and all other racial categories of modernity is marked by a power that almost exceeds rationality, right? And that modernity has like a metaphysical investment in a kind of in a violent subjugation of Blackness. And so the Afro-pessimists would hold that it's not really possible for there to be a universal appreciation of racial difference where Blackness is concerned. They hold that the history that builds the epistemologies and I guess also like the ontologies of modernity don't allow for imagined future of racial oneness. It's almost like, everything would have to be destroyed, right? Everything is contingent in their idea upon the construction of a human subject, which needs the negation of Blackness, right? So you can't have an appreciation of racial difference an embrace of racial difference in that construct that they offer. And so for someone like them, like the psychoanalyst Frantz Fanon, of course, is like really important. And in his seminal work, Black Skin, White Masks, he makes or at the very outset, he says something to the effect of, I hate to admit it, but the future of Blackness is whiteness, right? So by that, I think what he means is that, in the construction of modernity, there was no way in which Blackness could really be embraced in any kind of positive sense of the word, right? And it was so stigmatized, right? It was so deeply marked as the sign of aberration and sin in the creation of modernity that it would be impossible, and he's trying to sort of talk about the kind of alienation, the self-alienation experienced by Black people. It's almost impossible to embrace one's Blackness. And, I think that this is just one theory, but, it's a powerful one that we have to think deeply about. And particularly when we think about like the way in which Black life and culture and so forth, when it is embraced across racial difference, is so often inflected by a sense of transgression, right? To embrace Black life and Black culture for non-Black people, right, it almost like engage in some kind of, provocation, like there's a kind of transgressive element to it. I think that's important to just at least sit with and contemplate, right? Now, personally, I'm much more sanguine about the possibility of moving beyond racial difference, at least at some point in the future, right? And as I see it, the problem that we face for the future is not so much just the transcendence of difference, but the need to jettison stigma and honor, right, which are attached to racial difference, to racial identities. And I'm hopeful that we could do this because, as I said earlier, I think that these identities are primarily the products of collective narratives, right? And these narratives can be changed and manipulated. We can actually change the meanings of histories and of identities through concerted effort, I believe, And so, and we can see tangible examples of that. Again, for me, I'm, most familiar with the Black intellectual tradition. And we see that in the way that in the early 20th century, figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and people like Arthur Schomburg and so forth, these early Black historians began to salvage a history of enslavement in a way that made it something more than a mark of shame, right? They began to sort of change the narrative about what it meant to be, have a history of enslavement. And they began to underscore the kinds of strengths and the kinds of vision that were born out of that experience, right? And so through this kind of engagement with the discourse and this manipulation of it for certain political and ideological purposes, they, I think, made an intervention in the way that Black people thought about their history and then therefore thought about themselves. And these kind of interventions in the narratives of identity and of history have occurred from time to time with great force, often spearheaded by particular figures or particular schools of thought, right? And they have, in fact, really changed the way that we think about certain kinds of identities, right? And so it's my belief that as we go into the future, it's possible to develop different kinds of narratives of identity, and we can begin to bring to the surface kinds of appreciations for identities and histories which aren't necessarily available to us now. But that, again, as I said, through sort of concerted effort of discourse building and narrativizing our own identities, that communities will develop that create new conceptions of what it means to be, in one of these racial categories, and then ultimately, what it means to be a human being.
Right. Larry, you grapple with some of these questions quite directly in your work. How would you respond?
Yeah, so I have a kind of a different angle. I hope it's complementary to what Derik said. I do think that the idea of race as Derik described Gomez's conception of it as a hierarchicalization of human beings based on alleged characteristics of capability, intellect, moral worth, and beauty. That's the traditional idea of race, and it's just completely and totally horrible and false and should be totally rejected. And to me, there's no ambiguity about being able to get rid of that. Nevertheless, certain groups who have been subjected to race have been treated as if those ideas of race were true, have become racialized groups. And the idea of a racialized group is one, in a way, that Derik was speaking to. It's a group that recognizes that they have been treated as if they had these deficiencies, but they know they don't have those deficiencies. And so the idea of racialization both means treatment by people outside, mostly white people, oppressive treatment as an inferior being, treatment as if you yourself are incapable of going beyond a certain point in your own development. And but not only a recognition of, as it were, being mistreated by others, but also the development of a positive tradition of resistance against that racialization. And so you see that in many different movements, some of which Derik mentioned, like in the 20th century, people like Du Bois and Schomburg, who tried to sort of craft a conception of slavery that would bring dignity to the slaves, and not just kind of oppression. But also, of course, during the slave period, you had people like David Walker, who's starting to gain some attention now. He was a free Black who eventually located in Boston. He's from North Carolina, I think. And he wrote this fantastic sort of pamphlet / book called The Appeal to the Colored People of the World, in which he challenged Thomas Jefferson's view that Blacks were inferior. So there's this, tradition going way back of Black people challenging their own racialization. And those challenges, and of course the abolitionist movement, and then other movements, Garveyism, movements which affirmed the dignity and capability of Black people, those traditions are themselves sources of pride and honor. And so in your framing of the question, Shahrzad, it seemed to imply somehow that we have race is this bad thing from the past, and so we have to move to the future to transcend it. So I'm kind of suggesting a different picture, which is that there's a positive tradition already embedded in that history, and it's a tradition of resistance, and that tradition can then go in a whole bunch of different directions, some of which Derik mentioned. Afro-pessimism, for example, is one direction to go. There's the kind of pan-Blackness articulated by Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic. There's a more specifically political Blackness articulated by Tommy Shelby and We Who Are Black. And of course, there are various different sort of cultural directions that one can go. But I see all of them as in some way arising from this historical tradition of resistance. And that's how I would address the question.
So we've been swirling around the issue of intellectual history, and particularly the Enlightenment. And so now I wanted to turn to a series of questions that address that topic more directly. So wherever we look throughout history and around the world, examples of gross inequality and systemic oppression readily appear. Yet in societies that we have come to associate with terms such as the Enlightenment or the modern West, prevalent expressions of inequality and oppression tend to be uniquely intertwined with the category of race. So why is this the case, and how deep into the conceptual intellectual foundations of modern Western culture does oppressive racial thinking go? Larry, maybe we can begin with you.
Well, it just seems to me that that these societies are all founded on slavery, colonialism, sometimes settler colonialism, and imperialism. And all of these are deeply racialized forms of social order, so to speak. And so the embeddedness of race is not just the embeddedness of certain ways of thinking in people's heads. It's embedded in the structures of those societies. Those societies might have also articulated very noble ideals, like Enlightenment ideals, but they were the whole character of those societies, those Western societies, was completely intertwined with raciality, so to speak, in these different forms that it takes. And people there are movements in all of those societies, and some of them have been fairly recent. The kind of decolonizing movement, for example, it has gotten somewhat intertwined with the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter, even though it was based on an American event, it kind of went global, and it kind of got kind of taken up by the decolonizing movements, where especially the classic empires, the great empires of the UK and France, people are demanding that those countries come to grips with those histories, which they haven't done. And so it's not surprising that all of these nations still have such a deep raciality in their social structure, because they haven't done the work necessary to deal with that history, to sort of fully take it on, recognize it, have their school curricula built around it. I mean, this is like almost just starting to happen. Here's 2020. This has been going on for several centuries. And that's why race is so deeply embedded. And it's a daunting task to decolonize and to deracialize. But it's a task that people are starting to engage in. Of course, you see the backlash, the Trump Brexit, and so on. The rise of various forms of white nationalism all across Europe as a reaction against this attempt to come to terms with this racialized history. But there are some signs of hope for the long task ahead.
So, Derik, what insights would you add to what Larry had to say?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to add is this idea of that this racial thinking, of course, is so deeply embedded. And what happens, it seems to me, is that we understand how deeply embedded it is when we see what happens to these resistance movements that oppose sort of racial inequities, for example, right? And that there seems to be this kind of flexibility within, Western liberal democracies. And also, I want to say that's sort of a global systems kind of scale as well, to sort of reinvent race inequities, even as we think we are about to maybe address them squarely, right? And so I'll come back to that when we're thinking about sort of neoliberalism, for example, like the condition of neoliberalism, which continues to, it seems, divest, primarily, a non-white people of, power and material resources, and sort of funnel them into other, racial categories, primarily, among white people. But I would just say, the way that the question was framed is about the internal to these nations of the modern West. We see this ongoing inequity, right? And I think it's, when I'm thinking, when I'm talking about race within America, I always like to kind of put it in that larger global context, because oftentimes we imagine here in the US that, racial thinking is sort of unique. The way that we think about race is kind of unique to the US. But of course, that's not true. And we can see the same inequities play out on this global scale, right, between nation states, right? And we see that so-called Black nations are materially poor and the so-called white nations are materially rich. And right, these inequalities are obviously the result of histories of exploitation that we've been talking about, and then like a hypocritical enforcement of property rights and notions of territorial sovereignty in ways that almost always seem to be exclusively beneficial to European nation states and America, and almost never to the states, Black states of the global South and so forth, right? So the system of global capitalism that's developed over the last few hundred years continues to be caught in this like inertia of what I would call modernity's seminal impulse of exploitation based on racial difference. So like if we're like Larry brought up the example of France and its effort to grapple with its history, right? France in the 17th and 18th century, its crown jewel in its colonial empire was Haiti, right? One of the most, materially prosperous parts of the entire globe was, coming from the sugar crops that were harvested by enslaved Black people in Haiti of that time. And of course, then the moment of the Haitian Revolution at the turn of the 19th century, Haiti becomes a Black nation, the first Black nation in the Western Hemisphere, quickly becomes the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere, and continues to be to this day, right? Whereas France sort of retains its status as one of the world's wealthiest nations, right? So on the one hand, we have at the global scale, right, material prosperity seems to be indexed to nation states, according to race. This is also true of life chances and material prospects within these nation states of the West. And, I feel like we can think about it in a couple of different ways. The modern construction of racial differences emerges, again, from that desire to exploit land and labor. And I'll focus on Blackness here for a minute, right? And the political economy of modernity is built on a foundation in which Black labor costs nothing or next to nothing, right, in slavery. And that we're continually sort of haunted by that economic legacy, right? So Black life and labor continues to be undervalued, right? Because it has its origin in modernity as having no value, right? And so, we find the kind of seminal inequities of modernity are perpetuated into the contemporary because of the force of the initial impulse, right? And again, like the structures of capitalist, liberalist democracy don't seem up to the task of creating material equity, right? Again, because of, I think, of our historical origins. And I think if we think about the history like of recent Western capitalism, or neoliberalism, like we call it, where public goods are steadily privatized, and we generally move away from some kinds of distributive models of national wealth in an eye toward equality, right? That moment, like the moment where we move into what some people call neoliberalism, coincides with the moment when America seems to get serious about extending protections of rights, to non-white people, in the 1960s. Right, when you have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and so forth. And then you have these federal programs around affirmative action and state programs around affirmative action and so forth that are meant to kind of distribute wealth. What we see is a flexibility that then allows for economic structures to change, right, in a way that then kind of leads into a new regime of material disempowerment for non-white people within America and other Western nations. And we see the same thing kind of happening in even the most generous of these redistributive nations, like in Scandinavia and so forth, where as more non-white immigrants come into those spaces and racial difference becomes more of an element in those societies, we see a steady sort of retraction, right, of the social programs that try to distribute wealth with more equity, right? And I think that speaks to how deeply, to back to the question that you asked, man, like it's so deeply embedded that even in those moments when we think we're making progress, there is this kind of mutability and this flexibility, a protean nature to a kind of this investment in racial hierarchy that then we find new ways of enacting, this hierarchy, despite the advances that we seem to be seeing. And so that what has to be done is perhaps an even deeper kind of excavation of, of the identities and the narratives around identities that seem to guide liberal democracies in the West these days.
Yeah, I wanted to continue with this theme and sort of the perniciousness, the almost dialectical iteration of racism in Western culture and Western thought and Western society. It can lead to a certain polarized discourse, which I think we often encounter in academic disciplines, whether at the explicit or the implicit level. So on the one side, there's the claim that the universalism of Enlightenment humanism, particularly as expressed in the liberal rights-based tradition, is basically good and true, and that the only real challenge that we face today is to learn how to apply this framework of universal human rights of Enlightenment humanism in the current context of racially unjust societies. Racism, therefore, becomes something that is entirely inessential to the tradition of Enlightenment thought. On the other side, one encounters the assumption that the legacy of Enlightenment humanism, of liberal political thought, of liberal societies, is so intertwined with racist ontologies that any attempts to use its basic categories will tend to recreate the racial hierarchies that be. So from this angle, racism is something essential to the legacy of Enlightenment thought, and something that we can only overcome by generating entirely new ways of thinking about and approaching the relevant issues. So I'd be interested to hear how both of you approach this basic conceptual dilemma. How does this dilemma influence discourse in your respective fields? How in your own work have you sought to navigate and sort of find a way beyond or between the resultant tensions? Larry, let's start with you.
Well, so first of all, as you all mentioned early on, the Enlightenment ideals are an important achievement. Nevertheless, even as ideals, they are somewhat limited. So I just want to kind of keep that in mind. I think that many of us are in agreement that the notion of rationality that is the foundation of Enlightenment universalism is too thin. It doesn't capture the full spiritual dimensions of life and the emotional dimensions of life as well. So sort of keeping in mind, these are important ideals, but they're also limited. But okay, so sticking within that framework, it still raises the question, how deeply embedded are racial ways of thought in those kind of rationalist Enlightenment traditions? And to some extent, within philosophy, a lot of very interesting work has been done on this question, especially in relationship to Immanuel Kant, probably the greatest Enlightenment thinker. But as Charles Mills, who's probably the most important philosopher who's kind of addressed this Enlightenment issue, and especially in relationship to Kant, and he has shown, I think, pretty strongly that Kant, while he had a kind of formal universalism in which he attributed rational capacity to all human beings, he also was one of the foremost developers of a biologistic hierarchical view of race. I mean, he was in the tradition of Linnaeus and Blumenbach. He was, in that period, philosophers were also, as it were, natural scientists and were sort of thought that way. And Kant addressed a lot of issues like that, but we think of Kant as this like incredible universalist, but he also combined that, perhaps somewhat inconsistently, with a racialist hierarchical view. So it's important to sort of look at what the threads in Enlightenment thought are that lead to, or that sort of open up to, racialist ways of thinking. And I think one important thread in that is the scientific naturalism that's part of Enlightenment thought. And the scientific naturalism, that aspired to have a non-theistic, complete explanation of the natural world, including human beings. And it had it involved a sort of classificatory project, which ended up classifying human beings in a hierarchy. I mean, sort of the whole world was a hierarchy. All of nature was kind of organized hierarchically. So that idea of scientific naturalism itself already contains hierarchicalist ideas. So the application of them to human beings isn't really that surprising. So in that way, I'm in agreement with the people who think that racialist ideas are more core to Enlightenment ways of thinking, and that you can't just say, well, the ideals are fine. All we have to do is just apply them to groups that we didn't used to apply them to. That's like kind of a simple model of, oops, we overlooked Black people. Oops, we overlooked women. We'll just apply these universals ideas to them. So that doesn't seem to me right. But I also think that the view that Enlightenment thought is so corrupted by its entanglement with racialism that it's of no value. That doesn't seem to me right either. So I would go for something that's kind of in the middle, where you have to engage in this project, that I was mentioning before, of kind of deracializing and decolonizing thought. And in order to do that, that's a very ambitious project. It means you have to really rethink all of your categories and all of your history, and you have to go back over that and sort of understand the oppressive features of your history. You can work your way out of that. But without going through that, you can't just like take an ideal and just say, oh, okay, I'm just going to apply it to this group over here, because you're not going to be able to apply it appropriately unless you understand what it is about those groups that has kept them in the unequal situation which, Derik explained. And I want to pick up a thread of what Derik said to sort of add to what I've just said, which is that the neoliberal form of capitalism, finance capitalism as it's developed, especially in the post-1980 period, has to be seen as a distinctive force that has very strong racial implications, but it can't be understood just through race theory, so to speak. You've got to bring in an understanding of the complexities of neoliberalism. And so that's got to be, it isn't just a matter of dealing with the racial history. You have to deal with the economic system, the global economic system that we live under. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to realize even the flawed ideals of the Enlightenment.
So Derik, I'm very much looking forward to hear what you have to say about this, and also some of the particular insights that and ways this topic is being discussed in your own field.
Yeah, thanks, Bennett. Thanks, Larry, for that. I really appreciate the particularly the final piece of what you had to say, Larry, about sort of like the complexity of neoliberalism and it not being sort of reducible totally to race, right? And I think that, one of the ways in which that sort of manifests in my own thinking, in my own work a lot is in the prison, right? Because there is a propensity on the part of some to sort of just think about the prison as the American prison system that we have today as a recapitulation of old racial order, right? That is, it's like the reappearance of slavery or something like that. But in fact, right, the way that I read the prison through people like Loic Quant and stuff is that it happens to be it happens to draw on racial discourse, right? But at the same time is an expression of like economic order of and the needs of the economic order of neoliberalism, right? What do you do with a kind of detritus of the labor market, right? What do you do when you are retracting a social safety net so that you can sort of funnel money into the penthouses of the class structure, right? You've got to come up with an apparatus for housing the leftovers, so to speak, right? And it just so happens, right, that because of our histories, there's a racialized component to those leftover individuals, right? But it can't be simply reduced to a recapitulation of a racist past. You've got to think in this complex way about it, right? So I really like that element that you brought in there, Larry. And for me, I'll sort of address the question by thinking about sort of the way that questions of universalism kind of like operate, it seems to me, in recent decades of Black intellectual history. And for people like, the Afro-pessimists and so forth, and for many others, I think, there's a way that the universalism of Enlightenment humanism seems like almost like a false flag operation, right? And it's like people have been asked to aspire towards universalism and to the ideas of liberalism, and then are kind of condemned for not being good liberals or not being good universalists, right? All the while, this is a kind of a view, I think, and one element of the Black intellectual tradition. All the while, the people who have propagated these Enlightenment ideals are, sort of exploiting the world, everywhere they turn, right? So for this maybe an avant-garde kind of Black studies strand of Afro-pessimism, there's an abdication totally of Enlightenment ideals and of the ideal of universalism. And I think this can be traced back to the 1960s, and again, to people like Fanon and so forth, who were saying, let's forget about this universalism, which has been sort of foisted upon us, right? So that they, these thinkers don't really believe in the Enlightenment tradition at all. And they think anti-Blackness is such a essential feature of Enlightenment thought that could only be solved with the destruction of the whole liberal order. And then I think that there are those who are working with a different set of assumptions. And these believe that, there's something like a liberal democracy and that universalist ideals are the best tools that we have for achieving some kind of equity. And if we struggle, like, we can extract the racist impurities from the edifice of liberal humanism, which does in fact contain within it, they would say, universalist possibility that could be expressed in multiracial democracy. And I'd say that the mainstream of like Black intellectuals who you see on TV and so forth are working with this premise. And maybe this is maybe reductive, but these are two significant and I think rigorously conceived approaches to Enlightenment universalism, and one that is pessimistic and one that holds out this hope that we could get to some kind of promised land of universal rights through the tools of liberal democracy. And my own thinking is somewhat hopeful, but also kind of like draws on resonances. It has resonances with Afro-pessimist thought, right? So it seems to me that the edifice, this is a very conceptual kind of idea I'm trying to build here, that the edifice of Western liberal democracy was constructed with racism as a scaffolding, right? And that it's proven very difficult to dismantle that scaffolding of racial difference and the narratives of white supremacy and anti-Blackness in particular, right? And so I don't think that liberal humanism of an Enlightenment sort of strand can take us to a universalist society. Like, it seems to me that that edifice is somehow always in the shadow of its racist scaffolding. And that what we need to do, right, is to, again, speaking in highly conceptual terms, right, is build new structures that may draw inspiration from some of the ideals that we associate with Western liberalism, ideals like freedom and democracy and the social contract and so forth. But that the conceptual frameworks of these new social structures that we're building need to be imbued with something that sanctifies an essential humanity of all people, right? That and that has to be built up within these new structures, which I think can draw from liberal humanism, but aren't going to be simply a refinement of it. as a Baha'i, someone who holds faith in the idea that beneath the identities of racial difference that modernity has given us, that there is there's a more fundamental identity, which is sacred and spiritual. And it seems to me that the way forward is to build up like social and intellectual frameworks that allow us to narrativize that sacred identity, right? And it seems to me that in those social and intellectual frameworks that we're going to put together to make use of concepts, we will make use of concepts that we associate with liberal humanism, but we'll also have to draw on epistemologies and traditions of thought that have been actively stigmatized and delegitimized, right, in the liberal tradition, right? And so as we go forward, we have to have this humble posture of learning as we orient ourselves in all kinds of directions to kind of assemble a new narrative about what it means to be human and what is necessary to create equality within human societies.
So this leads quite naturally into my next question, which is, having spoken at some length about the traditions of inquiry that stem from the European Enlightenment, it could be interesting to think more about the broader traditions that nourish your own thought. So Larry, you've shown serious interest in the work of Iris Murdoch, who's a key figure in the effort to retrieve the insights of ancient Greek and medieval Christian views of ethics and the human person. Derik, your work is primarily focused on culture and the arts, especially poetry. You're also quite upfront in some of your work about your own Baha'i commitments. You also mentioned your interest in Black church theology. Also, you both have notable interests in questions of pedagogy and race. You're both university professors, of course, but for those in your profession, you've taught in some unconventional settings. Larry, you've taught in a high school on race and racism, and your experience there forms the basis of your book, High Schools, Race and America's Future. Derik, you've taught in the prison system for several years. So I wonder if you could both speak more about how these and potentially other engagements that go beyond the normal traditions of Enlightenment thought and political engagement continue to shape your own thinking about race. And also more broadly, how you envision the role that diverse intellectual, expressive, cultural, activist traditions might play in helping us move beyond some of the longstanding confusions that surround the topic of race. Derik, let's begin with you.
Sorry about that. So I'll try and keep this real quick. I think that for me, I have been very much shaped by, over the last 10 years or so, by my sort of work inside of prisons and teaching in prisons. And I can recall like one of the first times I went into a prison to teach. And it is in upstate New York in this beautiful valley, this rural bucolic setting, where so many of the prisons are in New York, right? In these rural communities, which were transformed in like the period of the 1970s and the deindustrialization of America, the automation of industry and the shipping of, sort of certain kinds of blue collar jobs overseas and so forth, right? And so that decimated certain kinds of communities, rural communities, all over the country here, in particularly in New York, right? But also like urban Black communities, right? And so there was these differing sort of ways in which that sort of transformation in the economy affected these different kinds of communities. And so, the prison arises, with this transformation of like the sort of the labor market in the US. And one of the ways that was dealt with, particularly in New York, but in other places as well, right, is that prisons became a kind of linchpin of certain rural economies, right? And so many of these small towns in upstate New York were sustained because massive prisons grew up there, right? And so what you would have is these primarily white men who are working in correctional officers and administrators in these prisons, and then primarily Black and Latino men who are drawn from the urban spaces of New York City, Syracuse, Albany, and so forth, and put into these prisons. And then surveillance of those men were in some ways like the foundation of the economy of these rural spaces. And so I remember the first time I went into Eastern Correctional Facility in upstate New York, I saw like this image that has always struck me so powerfully, right? And it was a Black man walking down the corridor, just laden in chains, right? He had chains around his feet, around his arms. The chains from his feet to his arms were connected, and he was being guided by these 4 white correctional officers. And this always struck me, not so much because it recalled that history of slavery, right, that we've been talking about, but maybe even more so is because this man, I don't know what danger he presented, right? This man, seemed to be viewed as like a beast, essentially, right? Something that was less than human, and it seemed to me that he had been robbed of this kind of inherent nobility, which I think is, the birthright of every human being. As a Baha'i, I think that, there is this kind of inherent nobility to our spiritual identities that we all have, and that this man had been, that had been taken from him. And when I went up inside the classroom inside of Eastern Correctional Facility, I engaged in the most deeply sort of human kinds of exchanges with the incarcerated students who were there. And, they weren't in chains, but they were going back to cages after the class, right? And I think that we have, as a society, normalized certain kinds of narratives about what to expect and what is acceptable within our society based on categories of racial difference. And going into the prison does a couple things for me, right? It sort of confronts me with that reality that we have normalized these incredibly oppressive kinds of narratives on the one hand, and forces me to sort of grapple with that on a regular basis. In fact, just as we're doing this talk right now, my class is going on, on the inside. I have like a video class, hookup right now, and they're watching a film as I'm doing this. So I'm confronted with that very frequently. But then the other sort of way that I think that it helps me, or I gain some kind of, I think, sense of value for myself from doing this work inside of the prison space, is that what we see is that through processes of education and through processes that occur in the classroom through intellectual exchange, individuals begin to develop new narratives about what is possible for themselves, right? And they begin to sort of transform their identities about what they think they are when they are exposed to historical narratives and when they're exposed to narratives about race, which are more affirming, right? And which give value to that nobility, right, which is inherent within them. And we don't do enough of that in our culture, and I feel that sort of my work inside of the prisons, but also on the college campus, is meant to, bring up these new narratives, these new stories that we can tell about ourselves as individuals, but then also as collectivities, and about these fundamental identities, which we need to surface through, again, what I've described as kind of storytelling and of narrativizing. So I would say that that's one way to answer this question.
Valeria.
So I know we don't have much time. So I'm just going to focus on the high school teaching that I did. That was really, in some ways, the most remarkable professional experience I've had in my life. I kind of drifted into teaching at my own local high school. I taught a course on race and racism for consecutive years. I had been teaching in an education program at UMass and was feeling the dissonance of being somebody who was teaching teachers on the one hand, but having never had any K through 12 experience. And because I was a local person, I was a slightly known quantity. So even though I had no training as a high school teacher, the high school allowed me to teach there. But the second reason that the high school was an attractive place is because it was a minority white high school. It's extremely diverse racially, socioeconomically, ethnically, sort of in all ways. And even though my university is the most diverse university in the UMass system, it wasn't as diverse as this minority white high school. And I wanted to offer a course that was a high level course, but wasn't in the AP, advanced placement system, which is in some ways a very rigid system. And so I was giving a course that was billed as something that was like what these students would encounter in college. But most of the students who signed up for the course had not taken AP courses. And that's sort of what I wanted. I wanted to be mostly a course for Black and Latinx students who wanted to go to college, but hadn't gotten on that track that a high school like this has, this track, this advanced placement track. And the tracking is, in some ways quite destructive aspect of these high schools. So I wanted to have a, predominantly Black and Latino population, but I also really wanted it to be a multiracial population as well. So the class mirrored basically the demographic of the school itself. And it gave me an opportunity to see what it would be like to teach racial material to this extremely diverse group of 17-year-olds, 16 and 17-year-olds. And I had the course be basically a historically focused course with a strong intellectual component. In other words, I think some students came in thinking that it would be a course where they would just talk about their own experience. But I wanted them to see race as, so to speak, a field of study that was an extremely intellectually demanding, but also fascinating area of study, and that you had to really work hard at it. And if you were Black, you might very well have learned things within your family, within your church, within your community that might help you understand it, but you wouldn't have engaged at this intellectual level typically in your high school experience prior to that. And what I was so pleased to discover was the willingness of all of these high school students to really engage with that material and to engage with each other across racial lines with that material. And of course, their experience, high school, a third feature about it, high school students are much less inhibited than college students. So they're not worried about whether something sounds, quote unquote, politically correct. I actually hate that expression, but they just were much more willing to say what they thought and what they felt. But they came to really appreciate the fellow learners in the community of the classroom. So even though people might be really upset by what somebody else said, there was sort of a spirit of respect and common learning that went on, and they recognized that they were learning new things. So we read David Walker, for example, and his critique of Thomas Jefferson that I mentioned earlier. We read some slave narratives, but at the same time, I did this philosophical thing where I talked about race as an idea that was historically constructed in the very ways that we've been talking about today. And I introduced them to this idea that you have to go back to 1619 and even before to sort of like get the origins of it. And, almost none of them had been aware of anything like that history. Some had gotten little indications of it here and there. But that was also it was very exciting. And I just was very touched by it. And then I wrote that book that Ben mentioned, partly because I wanted to show adults that if 17-year-old kids from different racial groups can talk in a productive way about race with each other, hey, maybe we ought to be able to do that better than we're doing. Of course, it's actually gotten worse since then in certain ways, but in other ways, it's gotten better. I don't mean that my book contributed to that, but just the larger forces in society. But I was just very moved by my 4 semesters of teaching these these students. And I was sort of hoping that more people, I'm sure this is true now, many more people, building, say, on the 1619 Project and the New York Times and other sources of kind of new curriculum, and it's sort of much stronger recognition than when I was teaching about the importance of coming to grips with this history. So I'm sure courses like this are being given, much more frequently than they were when I did it. But anyway, I just wanted to get that in there because it was such a fantastic and it's sort of hopeful racial experience that I had.
Well, Larry Blum, Derik Smith, what a rich and interesting conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's a real honor to be doing this with you, Derik. It was fantastic.
Thank you. And thanks again also to our sponsors, the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, and the Center on Modernity and Transition. Note that you can watch videos of past events in this series on all those sponsors' websites. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We certainly hope that you'll do it again next time. That's on Friday, March 5th at 12:15 Eastern, when Ben and I will have the great pleasure of welcoming Prasenjit Duwara and Bentley Allen to discuss worldviews and world politics. See you then.
And thank you, Shahrzad and Ben. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.